Hello, welcome to week 3. We are moving right along in discovering the philosophy of the world. Our first week, we talked about education and how we start to learn what we know, what we become authority over. Our second week, we started talking about the mind and how we know the mind exists and thinking in terms of epistemology and how we can establish our existence as a mind. The third week, we talked about consciousness and what it means to become aware of ourselves and within this world and a sense of establishing arguments about ourselves. And then we moved to gods and thinking about our relations to this sense of a deity or gods as a way of talking about ontologies. This week we're going to be talking about the other person, you. How do I know you exist? How do I know you matter? Why should you matter? What is it? It's the relation of the self to the other, the I to the you. We're going to start talking about that, and I think we're actually going to continue talking about this idea a little bit next week because I think it's a really important idea, particularly for my own personal thing with philosophy. So, I'm into education and philosophy, and of course, within education and philosophy, there is this binary, the I and the you, the teacher and the student, the learner and the learned. So we're going to keep talking about this idea a little bit. I want to start us off this week by watching a little video, and then we'll get into a PowerPoint. The lecture won't be super long this week, but I've got some things to say, like I usually do. So let me share my screen. And we'll watch this short video.
It was brought up by some of your Democratic colleagues in the Congress. So my question to you is, you have refused in the past to talk about it. Are you willing to tell the American people tonight whether or not you will support either ending the filibuster or packing the court?
Whatever position I take on that, that'll become the issue. The issue is the American people should speak. You should go out and vote. You're in voting now. Vote and let your senators know how strongly you feel. Vote now.
You're going to pack the
Make
court?
sure you, in fact, let people know
He doesn't want
you're
to answer the
senators.
question.
I'm not going to answer the question
Why
because
would you answer that
because
question?
the question is
The Supreme Court justice,
the
radical
question.
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen, who is on your list, Joe?
This
Who's
is
on your
so
list?
Right, gentlemen, I think
This
we've
is so
ended this.
He's going to pack the court.
unprecedented.
We have,
I'm not going to give a list.
we have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it? Keep yapping, man.
The people understand, Joe.
They sure do.
47 years, you've done nothing. They understand.
All right.
So that was interesting. Starting off that moment, because I think it's actually kind of a perfect moment to think about what you mean in this current culture, in the ways that we're currently relating to each other. It tells us something about how we treat each other or what we think about each other. I'm going to be careful here because I think you probably know my politics. I don't hide them. I don't try to persuade you to accept my politics, but I certainly think it's disingenuous to pretend that I don't have a politics. And obviously, of the two people that were up there on that stage, I prefer one of them more than the other. I prefer a style more than the other. So I'm going to be careful here because I am going to talk about Biden's response and why it was, if not justified, it was understandable. And if not understandable, it reveals something about philosophy of others. And I want to talk about Trump's approach and how that reveals something about why we need a philosophy of others. So here it is. That moment where Biden says, "Will you shut up, man?" I know that moment. And actually, if you see, watch the clip closely and watch Biden's eyebrows. He is trying to answer Chris Wallace's question, sort of. I mean, he's evading the question a little bit, but he's trying to say why he's evading it and what's really important. And he's trying to answer the question, and then Trump starts yapping, as Biden said, yapping, and barking in his ear. And you can see right when that starts to happen, Biden's brow crinkles. There's almost pain there. He's trying to get a point out, and it's just not coming. He has to concentrate more. Biden has a history of stammering, stuttering that he has worked through. He's talked about quite openly. So he's having to concentrate more to get his words out. He's trying to make a connection, and there's this sound coming in his ear. And then he says, "Will you shut up, man?" And he says it after Trump talks about political radicals or liberal radicals, and it's just too much for Biden. He says, "Will you shut up, man?" I know that man. I know that when you use that term "man," it's a linguistic element of how people sometimes talk to each other, how guys sometimes talk. You shut up, man. And that word "man" seems like, especially following the word "shut up," it seems a little maybe disrespectful, but I actually think it's an attempt to draw a connection. I've used that word many times. I've used it in times when I'm in some kind of conflict or tension with somebody else. When I've used it in a classroom when a student is being a little belligerent or being a little inappropriate, and I say, "Will you shut up, man? Come on, man." I've used it with my kids when I have to say something like, "Come on, man, don't try to burn the dog." They've never done that. I use it, I've even used it in an argument with my wife before. "Come on, man." That word "man" is an attempt, I think, to try to redraw a connection between the self and the other, or to make yourself less other to the other person, to make it more real, this connection, because there's a real disruption connection between the two people, and you just need to try to build it. And you're frustrated, and you're not liking the other person, and you just say, "Come on, man, shut up, man." That word "man" is trying to call that person back into a relationship of humanity. Maybe that's stretching a bit far, but I think it's an interesting moment. You have a person over here who is not recognizing your humanity in any way, not recognizing your ability to speak. And Biden is here talking to the camera and trying to speak to you, the voter, and trying to make a connection. And he just loses it and says, "Shut up, man." Trying to rebuild a sense of humanity. I'm going to late for this to talk about the other. So, I got a PowerPoint this week. I don't have any awesome music videos, and I'm sorry about that. Let me move to the PowerPoint. That moment of argument is a moment of crisis. And I do think we may be in a bit of a crisis with each other. My wife was at a store last night, and a dude behind her was with his cart. And he had one of the short carts, and he kept on pushing up behind her, nearly touching her butt, from what she said. And she turned around and said, "Will you please back up 6 feet?" Because, those carts are small. And he said, "What, man? I'm just here." And she said, "Will you please back up?" And every time she inched forward a little bit, he kept on moving up, until finally she turned around and said, "I need you to back up. You are not far enough away from me," and started raising her voice. That sense that this dude behind her was not recognizing her space. It's a pretty common feeling right now. I think we've got to think about what the other means, what this other person means. Donald Trump has come down with coronavirus. is that other a person? How do we recognize the other? And if we have philosophies of the other, does that philosophy carry over to how we treat people or how we want to be treated? Okay. In order to get there, we're going to start with thinking about ideas about personal beliefs and feelings and senses. And this is going to the Sarah K. Paul essay. Dr. Paul is a philosopher. She's in CUNY, but in Dubai. I think it's CUNY. I may be wrong. Maybe it's City. I don't know. Anyway, she is writing an essay that we read, the responding to Gilbert Ryle, but also responding, as always, to Descartes, who says that we are our best authority about ourselves. We can justify our existence by knowing that we think, that thinking justifies our existence. And knowing that our minds exist means that we are something. Ryle replied to this by saying, well, no, your body and your mind exist together in the world. It's kind of a function that you have. And now Sarah Paul is replying as well. And what she does is a pretty interesting article because it lays out the basic foundation of argument for how we know ourselves or how we know each other, and then moves it to how we know each other, which tells us more about ourselves. So it's a complex argument. Here's what she establishes. She says there's 3 false ideas we have about ourselves, about knowing ourselves, and those ideas are that our personal beliefs, our feelings, our senses are self-evident. They don't require proof to make them true. I feel something. I don't need to offer proof to show you that it's true. I can just feel it, and it is. That they're infallible. That declaring a state for being for the self cannot be wrong. I can't. When I say I feel sad, you can't say no, you don't. I mean, you can, but it doesn't invalidate what I just said because it's infallible. I'm the best judge of it, and they are personally relevant. We declare for ourselves differently than we declare about others. My feelings, my beliefs, my senses, they are mine and they are relevant to me. I can't necessarily say your beliefs, your senses, your experiences are not real or are real. I can only just justify myself. And Dr. Paul tells us that these basic tenets of belief about the self are wrong. She wants us to move to a different sense. I'm going to move my video camera in. How do we know that others are real? That others matter? How do we know that our sense of self matters in relation to others? Well, what Dr. Paul tells us is that self-knowledge is likely true. It's probably true. The things that you know about yourself are true, but the knowledge that we have of others is slightly less. What she means by this is we're going to take it out of this infallible, you know yourself, you can declare yourself, and move it into a little bit of doubt. What we know about ourselves is probably true, but may not be. What we know about others is maybe true, but may not be. It goes from there to say that the knowledge of the self is a theory. We build these ideas about ourselves, and say that I am sad does not necessarily mean that I've defined sad or I understand sad. It's a way of just building a theory. It's usually based on evidence, but not always. Anybody who has been in therapy, who has spent time talking to a therapist, will tell you that this is absolutely true. What you know about yourself may not be what you know about yourself. Or what you say you know about yourself may not be true upon reflection. Her third point is we find out about others in the same ways that we find out about ourselves. So we build these hypotheses, these theories, with these ideas about ourselves, and we go and look at the evidence and we see if they're true, and we reflect and we think, and all this work we do with ourselves allows us to then turn to the other and then start to understand the other, which in turn allows us to go back and reflect on ourselves. Because if I make assumptions about people out here based on evidence, I can then reflect back on myself. I don't know myself necessarily unless I know who other people are. I wouldn't know how to feel about myself unless I saw other people. It's a really nice idea because it takes us away from just, I think, therefore I am. I am the Lord of myself. To, I need other people to know me. And I need other people to see me to be known. I just thought this was funny. Paul talks about Heidegger's idea of beetles and boxes. How can you trust somebody else? So somebody else has a box, and they say they have a beetle in it. And you have a box, and you say you have a beetle in it. How do we know that those two beetles are the same thing? Or how do we know our experiences of those two beetles are the same thing? I think what Paul says is, well, we can know, and it does matter that we think we know, because anything we know about ourselves is theoretical, so anything we know about others is theoretical, so we might as well just have theory together. We might as well just say, okay, when you say beetle, I'm going to trust you mean the same thing that I do. Until we can move together and start to figure out that what's in your box is not the same thing that's in my box, and we need to work that out. It's a very communicative sense, a very active sense of knowing the other. You're going to trust and then reassess and build theory together. It has very little to do with John, Paul, Ringo, and George. I just like beetles and boxes. We moved from Sarah Paul to reading about philosophers in quarantine, that news article that had 5 or 6 different philosophers talking about quarantine. And I thought that was an important read because at this moment, when we are sitting in our houses and things are shut down and we are feeling alone, how do we know the other? How do we know the other is real? What does quarantine tell us about ourselves, about others, about community? If I can't see you in action, is that changing how I perceive myself? If I rely on you to judge myself, to be able to see your face, to see what you think about me, I always, when I do something that I'm particularly proud of, the first person I want to look at is my wife to see what she's thinking, because she gives me my biggest sense of myself, or my biggest way of testing my theory about myself. So what happens to us to ourselves and others and community when we are in quarantine? What the authors that we read in that news article say is we are changing. Who we are is changing. What we do is changing. How we relate to each other is changing. What we do together is changing. And therefore meaning has changed. How we understand ourselves and others and community has changed. I think about my 12-year-old who's right at the beginning of adolescence. He is starting to develop more of a sense of himself and establish more of that sense of himself. And then all of a sudden, bam, he's cut off and he is staying at home. He has had 4 or 5 very safe, very distant play dates with people, but that's it. He's seen, other than going to a store where he is masked and separated, he has seen very few people. What does it mean for himself, his understanding of others, when he's so isolated? What those philosophers tell us is that we've got to rethink what our meaning is at this moment and why that meaning matters. And we've got to rethink how we relate to each other and and we've got to consider what we do to keep ourselves centered as a self. Maybe I should say a word of explanation about the picture, just in case you don't know. There's a show called Community. It's about community college. It's a hilarious show, amazing show, and they did a live reading of a script from one of the episodes with the actors on Zoom. Get it? What does quarantine tell us about community? Okay. Our last reading for the week was by Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. I'm sorry, not a reading. We had a video about love, and I thought that was an interesting way to kind of think about how we relate to each other. It wasn't a very deep one, and maybe I should have had you read some de Beauvoir, but I don't know how to say her name, and it embarrasses me every time I try to say it. Maybe I should have had you read some, because she's brilliant and amazing, and she had a lot to say about how we constitute ourselves in relation to the other. And in particular, let's be clear, she was not necessarily writing about all people. She was writing about women and how women are subjugated and how women are held apart, how women are separated from real identity because of the power of men. In thinking about that, she comes up with some pretty interesting ideas about the self and the other. So here's one of her quotes. To emancipate women is not to refuse to confine her to the relations she bears to man, not to deny them to her. So she in this statement and in the philosophy, she's saying, look, we're not saying get rid of men. And we're not saying that women cannot have relationships to men. What we're saying is that men are oppressive to the identity and the self of women, that they have put them into a location of other, and they will never be able to connect with them if women are not emancipated. And women will never be able to connect to men. And women will never be able to connect to others because they are put in this place, this lockdown place. And all you have to do is think about, let's say, a housewife in the 60s or 50s and being locked into the sense that you are your husband's property, you are washing the dishes, and you are making the dinner, and you have this very defined role that you cannot get out of. That may be a little bit inconceivable today, although certainly we still have an awful lot of suppression of women. It may be a little inconceivable to think about that housewife in the 40s and the 50s, but it's there. Go and look. And what you will find is that women were still considered not to be fully human. Up until, I think it was the late 60s, maybe early 70s, women were not allowed to have credit cards in their own name. Women weren't allowed to be, if they had a husband, not allowed to have a house in their name. Everything was Mrs. Mike Hill. I mean, 100 years ago, women weren't allowed to have a voice in who they thought should be president. If that doesn't motivate you to vote, I don't know what will. If you're a woman. Let's go back to the quote. To emancipate women is not to refuse to confine her to the relation she bears to man, not to deny them to her. Let her have her independent existence, and she will continue nonetheless to exist for him also. So, let a woman be authority of herself. Let her be intentionally herself. Let a woman discover who she is, just like we allow men to discover who they are. And there's a little bit of pointedness here because it comes from a passage in The Second Sex that's talking about relations between the sexes. what she is saying is a man becomes oppressive, particularly in a sexual relationship, because he demands that a woman become something for him, a receptacle, if you will, for all of his desire. And what de Beauvoir is saying is that you have to allow a woman to be independent if that's going to be a real relationship. If this is going to be something authentic, you've got to let a woman be independent, so that they can mutually recognize each other as subject, but each other will yet remain an other for the other. It's a little bit heady. What she is saying is, as it stands, when a man is on top of a woman, and you can take that however you will. When a man is on top of a woman, he is suppressing the woman. And it is not until those two figures can stand side by side and see each other that real humanity happens. If we take this idea and we combine it with the earlier idea by, I forgot her last name, Dr. Sarah Paul, the idea of two others standing here, how do they then know each other? Well, they know each other by communicating what their theories of each other are. It begins to build a pretty profound sense of what we know about the other and about ourselves. Being ourselves apart and with the other, what do we require there? If we take those three tenets that we had from Sarah Paul, and we add in this uncertainty that comes from the coronavirus, and we add in this sense of need for autonomous self that comes from de Beauvoir, well, one can only know oneself if one is autonomous. You can't know yourself unless you are a self and you are separate from somebody else. People under oppression, people who are suppressed, people who are demanded that they be one thing and are never allowed to find out who they are themselves, are not necessarily autonomous. Maybe nobody's autonomous. Second, we will always be other to the other. We can never take these two people and combine them into one. The other will always be other to us. I'm always going to be separated. I will never be one with this person. And this person will never see themselves as one with me. It's a hard lesson for some people to learn. I think about my baby boy who I held in my arms, who was made out of me and my wife. And I think about him and think about how amazingly precious he is to me. Of course he's a part of who I am, except he is other. And it's only once I start to release him from that ultimate connection between us, and he starts to release me from that ultimate connection between us, that he can become something autonomous in himself. The third thing, we can know and enhance the other and the other us as long as we recognize and preserve autonomy. If we take Sarah Paul and we take this sense of uncertainty growing from the coronavirus, and we take de Beauvoir's sense of autonomy, and we combine them, we get a pretty deep idea, I think, about how we can relate to each other, how we can overcome this need to just have these people who bicker about what reality is. We can only know ourselves if we're autonomous. We need to recognize our othering from other people, and we need to recognize why that's important, that we can't really necessarily know everything about that person, but we can talk. And we can only know and enhance the other. We can only become something with the other when we recognize and preserve our autonomy from the other. And then we engage in discourse, as this lovely couple on this news story from glad.org shows us. philosophy of the other is important. It's important because if we are just going to be Cartesian, and we're just going to say that I think, therefore I am, we are cutting out most of the world. Most of the world. In fact, all the world is other. And in order to come to terms with that, we need to understand how Descartes was wrong, or how Descartes was problematic, and where we go to understand what the other is. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and we're going to look at yet another idea of the other. I'm also going to be posting some updates on the course, and we'll be talking about some of the more work part of the courses, the project and the exam, in the next couple days. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're making connections with people. Man. Take care. Have a great week.